Good afternoon. My name is Kristen Wynn, State Literacy Director, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Melissa Beck, K-3 Assessment Coordinator, and Laurie Weathersby, Director of Intervention Services. This presentation, as well as the recently released 2021 LBPA FAQ document, may be found on our website at www.mdek12.org/literacy updates for the 2021 school year. As with all of our presentations, we begin with the mission and vision of the MDE. Our vision is to create a world-class educational system that gives students the knowledge and skills to be successful in college and in the workforce. Our mission also is to provide leadership through the development of policy and accountability systems so that all students are prepared to compete in the global community. This presentation aligns to our State Board of Education goal number 1, all students proficient and showing growth in all assessed areas. During this presentation this afternoon, we will briefly discuss and provide an overview of the Literacy-Based Promotion Act. We will look at screeners and diagnostic assessments and provide information on connecting the dots with MTSS, RTI, and IRPs. We will also provide you additional information regarding LBPA updates and waivers, and then we'll end the presentation with a list of resources and our contact information. So let's begin with a brief overview of the LBPA. Passed in 2013, the Literacy-Based Promotion Act places an emphasis on prevention and intervention by focusing on ensuring students are reading at or above grade level by the end of 3rd grade. Also, as we all know, the LBPA calls for all kindergarten through 3rd grade students to be administered a universal screener 3 times per year. In addition, kindergarten students are administered the K Readiness Assessment twice a year. Please note the second bullet. If districts use Readiness as their screener, then the Kindergarten Readiness Assessment suffices as the BOY and EOY universal screener, since the K Readiness Assessment is STAR Early Literacy. However, if your district chooses to use something other than Renaissance, the Kindergarten Readiness and the universal screener must both be given. As you can see, this table includes, and here we outline the required screeners and assessment for pre-K through 3rd grade on this particular table. This table is also found in our Universal Screener Guidance document. So just for a moment, let's briefly discuss screeners and diagnostics. Oftentimes, these terms are used interchangeably in the educational world. So a universal screener assessment helps teachers to identify the who. That's the key word there. Which students are at risk for not meeting grade level learning goals. So the National Center for Improving Literacy provided these guiding questions after administering the universal screening. It is so important that we understand as educators that multiple data points must be looked at to determine the best route for interventions for our students. These guiding questions are listed as follows. Number 1, is the student at risk for dyslexia or not meeting important pre-reading and reading goals expected for the grade level? Is the student making enough reading progress to read proficiently and reach important reading goals? Is the student reading with sufficient proficiency to meet the expectations at the grade level and the important reading goals? And for students not making adequate progress despite the interventions, what additional intervention approaches have the best chance of improving reading rates and reading progress for our students? So these questions are guiding questions that you may use after you administer a universal screener and you've looked at multiple data points for this particular student. In addition, the National Center for Improving Literacy identifies 3 levels of instructional support for students based on their overall reading proficiency. The levels of instructional support are core classroom instruction, and core classroom instruction should happen for all students. The next level of support is moderate additional support. This may be the support for your Tier 2 students. For these students, these are students that are reading somewhat below grade level expectations. They are at moderate risk for reading problems. And then you have the levels of intensive additional support for students reading below grade level expectations. These may be your Tier 3 students, and they're typically at a higher risk for reading problems. Please note this. If students are receiving moderate or intensive additional support, all students still should be receiving core reading instruction. The moderate and intensive additional support is just as stated. It is additional support. Next slide. So, diagnostic assessment. A diagnostic assessment provides the detailed information about students' reading skills for the purpose of developing and implementing individualized interventions for our students. Some diagnostic assessments may include those we have listed here on the following slide. The quick phonics screener. You may choose to do for students a decoding inventory, a spelling inventory, the PASS phonological awareness assessment, and that is a free assessment, DIBELS, and then the San Diego quick assessment is one that can be given for word identification from pre-primer or pre-K all the way to 12th grade. It's also important to note that some intervention programs that your district or school may have purchased may include a built-in diagnostic assessment. In addition, some of our screeners have the information to be considered a diagnostic assessment.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laurie Weathersby. I'm the Director of the Office of Intervention Services, and I'm going to talk to you about how all of this connects with MTSS. We'll talk briefly about RTI and, of course, IRPs. So to start, MTSS. What is MTSS? We call it a multi-tiered system of supports. Is widely considered an umbrella or a framework, and it encompasses the whole child. So we really are looking at all parts. So the behavior, attendance, any social, emotional issues. So we're essentially combining PBIS, so the behavior side, along with RTI. So here is the definition that we have adopted in Mississippi. So we really see it as a framework. It is team-based. We do not want one person to have to make the decisions for a child. We want it to be team-based. It is data informed, it is evidence based, and it is flexible. And when we say it is flexible, you are not stuck to one strategy or one approach. You can make changes within an MTSS framework, and it is there to meet the students' needs in academic and behavior. And we really mean all students. So when we say all, we mean all. So on this is the graphic that we have at the department when we talk about MTSS, and it just shows all of the components that we have. And you see here shared leadership, which is something that is right in our definition. It definitely encompasses the academic supports and behavior supports, and you see how it is just a wheel, a circle, and we have to have all of the components for MTSS to be effective. So RTI, we know about RTI. It has been around for a long time. That is a framework that calls for research-based interventions to be implemented for our struggling students. So when we think about MTSS, think back to that big umbrella. We think about all of our students receiving support. So it's not just our students who struggle. It's our students who are maybe the overachievers or high flyers. We have to support them as well. We have to encourage them to grow, and all of that falls into MTSS. And when we think of RTI, we think of our students who are struggling and what are we going to put in place for them to give them the supports that they need. With PBIS, it's also a framework, and that's looking at having positive experiences for our students, reinforcing whenever we see them behaving positively, and reinforce that with positive interventions. So here we have IRPs, and we're going to talk to you about the different components of the IRPs. So first, why do we have the IRPs? So the Literacy-Based Promotion Act was amended in 2016, and it was amended to include the individual reading plan. It increased our expectations for our third grade students beginning in the 2018-2019 school year. So any students in K-3 that exhibit a substantial deficiency in reading, as well as students who were promoted to fourth grade under a good cause exemption, should have an IRP on file. So here are the components of the IRP. So intensive reading instruction and intervention must be documented for each student in an individual reading plan. And so it has to include the following. So it has to have the student's specific diagnosed reading skill deficiencies as determined or identified by diagnostic assessment. And so you see here in our MTSS documentation packet, this is where you would document that. For B, the goals and benchmarks for growth. So you would put this in the same column, you know, the goals and your benchmarks that you want to see over time. And then how progress will be monitored and evaluated. So once again, you use that third column, and that's how you're going to document how you're going to progress, how you're going to monitor that progress. So for letter D, the type of additional instructional services and interventions the students will receive, and that is this part here that has been circled for you. And then the research-based reading instructional programming the teacher will use to provide reading instruction addressing the areas of phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. So once again, this is where you would document both of those components. So the next two components, you would have the strategies the student's parent is encouraged to use in assisting the student to achieve reading competency, and then any additional services the teacher deems available and appropriate to accelerate the student's reading skill development. And so here you see the image of our parents read at home plan. So this is something that you can send home and make sure that parents understand the areas that the student, those deficit areas, and then they can use the read at home plan to use strategies at home. So why is it so important for us to talk about MTSS when we're talking about the individual reading plan? So the IRP is included in the MTSS documentation packet that is required for our Tier 3 kids. So these pages may be used when meeting with the TST for each student that did not respond to Tier 2 interventions. It can also be used for our fourth grade students requiring intensive interventions after a good cause exemption promotion, or for intensive reading interventions for our English learner students. And here we have the link to our website where you can get more information, and it has a link to our documentation packet. So you see here, this is the new checklist that we're going to use. Now we have an individual reading plan alignment checklist. So our students, we're no longer going to require that there is a separate individual reading plan documentation packet. So now you're going to complete the MTSS documentation packet along with this checklist. So if you identify that a student needs an IRP, you will have this checklist along with the documentation packet. And what I like about this is you write the student's name, teacher, grade, and date. And then you're checking as you're completing the documentation packet. So as I'm going through and I'm filling out these forms, and you see it here, it has them all listed, the page number that's in the documentation packet, and the forms that you'll be using. So you are just checking off that you are completing them as you go. If we are to come out to your school, our office, we come out and we'll do monitoring visits and look at, Tier 3 documentation. So one of the questions that we may ask is, we want to see your IRPs. So this checklist is what we're going to be looking for. We want to see this alignment checklist along with the MTSS documentation packet. Okay, so for this school year, for the 2020-2021 school year, it is recommended that an IRP be completed after results from both the beginning of the year screener and the first progress monitoring assessment, which typically occurs in September, have been administered. So why are we recommending that for this year? Because we know we had unfinished school from the last school year. We had an extended amount of time where our students were not in that structured classroom environment. So they may have struggled on that universal screener when they first came back. So we don't want you to just use that one piece of data. We want you to look at multiple pieces of data. Use your universal screener and then see how they're performing in the classroom. You may want to do additional diagnostic pieces. Once a student has been identified, it's recommended that additional diagnostic information be gathered to make the determination for intervention. Therefore, multiple data points should be used to determine substantial reading deficiencies. So like I said, do not just use that first universal screener data point. We want you to use multiple data points. An IRP is not required if the K-4 student currently has an IEP with reading goals. However, if a student's IEP does not currently address reading difficulties and the student later develops a deficit in reading, then the general education and the special education teacher must collaborate to determine whether goals need to be added to the IEP or if an IRP is most appropriate. The IRP serves as a tool for documenting intensive reading instruction and interventions for students with identified reading deficiencies. These can be documented using the MTSS documentation packet. Like I said before, you do not need to use a separate IRP documentation packet. You will utilize the MTSS documentation packet along with the IRP MTSS alignment checklist. If a student has an IEP that only has math goals and the student later begins to struggle in reading, then an IRP must be written for that K-4 student. The individual needs of the student should dictate the goals and the supports provided. The general education teacher and the special education teacher should work collaboratively to develop and implement the IEP and continue to progress monitor as indicated in the IEP. The goal of this is to make sure you have that documentation, because if it comes to the end of third grade and this student may need to have a good cause exemption for promotion, then you want to make sure you have had this documented over time. And so if that hasn't been documented in the student's IEP, then you would need it documented in an IRP.
Good afternoon. My name is Melissa Beck, and I'm a K-3 assessor. So today we're going to talk about the LBPA and some updates to the FAQ and then the waivers that were given this fall. So first we're going to talk about some updates. If a student's IEP addresses reading difficulties and includes specific goals that address those difficulties, then the IEP and progress monitoring of current goals will be considered as documentations of interventions. However, if the student's IEP does not address reading difficulties, then the IEP cannot serve as intervention documentation. So for students with IEPs, you really need to look at one thing. Do they have reading goals addressed or not? And as Lori said, if they don't have reading goals that are addressed, then they would either need to have an IRP written, or the IEP would need to be amended to add those reading goals. So this fall, the State Board of Education approved some waivers concerning good cause exemption documentation. For good cause exemption C and E, the 2 years of intervention requirements are reduced to 1 year. So in the good cause exemption documentation packet, when you complete it, please indicate the school's grade level, kindergarten through third grade during the 2019-2020 school year. So what that means is good cause exemption C now requires 1 year of intervention and 1 year of retention, and then good cause exemption E would be 1 year of intervention and then 2 years of retention for the 2019 or 2020-21 school year. All right, so here we're going to look at some additional resources and suggestions. So first, you're going to see the virtual literacy instruction guide listed here as a resource, and then you'll see the MTSS documentation packet, which Lori mentioned, and then you'll look at the MTSS guidance document that's provided, and then the last resource that we've provided is the ELA literacy instructional planning guide. Here are the locations where you can go on our webpage and find additional information concerning IRPs, IEPs, and then anything dealing with the third grade reading test on the student assessment webpage. And also, if you need to contact us with any questions, our contact information was listed on the first slide. Thank you and have a great afternoon.